This video is looking at color depth. And with color depth, we have to look at the same aspects of color as we did with vibration. Those are temperature, value, and saturation. Temperature being red the warmest, and cyan being the coolest. So looking at hue a little closer, we have these reds that should proceed to the foreground, should appear closer to us than the cyan that is the coolest, which should recede in the background based on the theory. We also have to take into consideration the saturation and value, but we're going to cover that shortly. Design can also play a role, and that is something you want to kind of think about as having the larger objects in the foreground, smaller in the background. It's a very simple kind of idea, and just to emphasize it a little further. So looking at the hues, we know from previous assignments that the hues all have their own value. We can tell here that this was yellow, cyan is very light in value, and value plays a role in depth. Lighter values come forward, darker values recede. So that's why we get some conflict here in what we're seeing. And that's when, as you're working on this assignment, you want to balance these considerations of temperature, saturation, and value. So moving to the saturation, we know that we can change our saturation in equal increments by bringing up the hue saturation tool here. And this is something you should consider doing as well with this assignment, is keeping that even gradation to give, to help that illusion of depth kind of really be a concrete visual experience for the viewer. So as I kind of finish this, we can see here that I've lowered the value of the saturation as we recede back to the center point, which is intended to be the furthest away from us. But once we've changed this saturation, something to consider as we did with the tones in week 1 is the value. What happened with the value? And in this case, we have the lighter values being in the foreground, the darker values in the background. And this is something, going back to the color wheels, that, picking our values of our temperature differences first can really save us a lot of work on the back end of this assignment. So when looking at, working with our hues, there's two ways we can do this. We can do this here in the HSB color window, or we again can bring up the hue saturation tool, and change it here. This plus or minus is in degrees in relation to the color. Any way you want to change it will work. I'm not on the correct layer right now, so you're not seeing this change, but just to show you, to kind of clarify this, here we go, plus going back to red, negative going closer to cyan, and moving around. This may be a little harder for you. If it is, stick with the HSB in making your transition. But again, a smooth transition can help add to this idea of depth. So here we have, where I went from magenta, I used the lighter value of the magenta and the warmer aspects of it, contrasted against these, blue background hues. And that idea helps of thinking that value ahead of time. So I have this transition of a warmer, relatively warmer than the blue, transition from warm to cool in the background. And as we look at this and thinking about it, you do have to think about the value. So switching over to a grayscale will help. It helps you see this transition, lighter to darker, darker going back, lighter coming forward. And kind of like with all our assignments, we definitely want to focus on, having this clear indication that we have our lighter values in our foreground, our warmer temperatures in the foreground, our higher saturation in the foreground, and everything else kind of the lowest saturations, the darker values, the coolest colors in the background. There should be this clear transition to prevent any type of conflicts where we would, experience with the initial image down here, where there was not any changes or any consideration to value or temperature. So once you've gotten to this point and you've kind of considered that you're using larger shapes in the foreground, which is a basic aspect of design, something smaller in the background, maybe you want to play with it a little more. Maybe this is a little boring. That's fine. Play with it. I just want to see the colors are right. I've kind of made this design. It's a little bit of a pattern. Maybe it's a little more interesting to you. Maybe it's not. Figure out what's good for you. Make it work. Make this your own. As with all the assignments. And have some fun with it. Maybe you want to submit a couple variations. As long as the color's correct, we can talk about the different design variations. Something like this may be a little too small because then you lose this sense of depth. But, somebody else may like it. And those are things that are open to discussion. But for the color, we want to have a clear indication that warmer hues are in the foreground. Again, lighter values are in the foreground, and high saturations are in the foreground. And everything else transitions to the background. So let's see some drafts and see where we go from there. Thanks.